I quit my job at a school this past spring break, and today is my first day not working there. And since it's Friday, that means I get to tell you all about some truly scary stories. So let's go ahead and jump right into it with 3 scary true last day of school horror stories. Alright, now for the first story. I was working in a classroom. It was my second year there. The students were around 6, 7 years old. This was our last day of school before spring break, and we had a substitute teacher coming in for the morning because our principal had us all work half days on Fridays during spring break. We got done with lunch, and it was my responsibility to get them all settled back down after lunch. One girl who had been talking to her friend nonstop wouldn't stop talking. She was being very disruptive and disrespectful to this substitute teacher who was clearly getting very annoyed. I sent her to the principal's office. She starts running down the hallway towards the principal's office, and I hear her scream, "You can't make me," over and over again. Well, I get to the principal's office and he's gone. He doesn't have his keys. So I knock and I open the door and she's gone. Now, the doors in the school don't lock from the inside. They only lock from the outside. I immediately start looking for her, and I'm freaking out because she could have literally gone anywhere. There's a back stairwell where kids like to hang out. It leads to an unlocked door, and no one knows what's behind that door. I look everywhere, and I cannot find her. I'm about to call the cops because she's never just gonna run away from home. She's a good kid. Something must have happened to her. And then I look in the last place I think to look, the lost and found room. This is where we keep all the stuff that students lose throughout the year. No one ever comes in here. And there she was sitting on a table playing with one of the kids' shoes. And I ask her, "Why didn't you just tell me you wanted to go home?" And she looks up at me and says, "I couldn't. I wasn't allowed to." And then she goes back to playing with the shoe. Now, I don't know if this was some kind of weird field trip or something, but she wasn't allowed to go home because she was being kept as a prisoner. That's what I took away from that story. She was being kept as a prisoner. I called the cops, and then I went back to the principal's office, and I wrote her name down on a piece of paper, and I drew a big red X through it because that was our code if a student was missing. I placed that piece of paper on his desk so that when he came back, he would know exactly what happened. And I still to this day do not know where she went or what happened to her. But that's neither here nor there because the most important thing is that she's okay, right? Yeah, okay, oh my god. Now, the next story comes from my own personal life. So I was in 3rd grade. We were at school until 4:30 every day. And on the last day of school before summer vacation, my mom was late picking me up. And so I ended up having to stay in the classroom by myself. All the lights were turned off. The blinds were shut. It was pitch black in that room. And I remember pacing back and forth across that classroom, waiting for my mom to pick me up. I kept hearing what sounded like footsteps pacing back and forth on the other side of the room. Now, I'm telling you this, the hair on my arms is standing up right now, and I can tell you that there were definitely no footsteps, but I remember clearly hearing footsteps pacing back and forth. Then I started hearing what sounded like whispers on the other side of the room, whispers that sounded like they were coming from underneath the bed. My mind was going crazy. What was going on in there? Was I going insane? You know, these are things that I couldn't explain. And obviously, I was just letting my imagination run wild. Or maybe I was going crazy. I don't know. Anyways, I heard a bang on the door and I jumped and I screamed. And then I heard another bang followed by my mom opening the door and calling my name. I ran and I threw myself into her arms, and I haven't been back in that classroom since. Now, I've talked to people who say that classrooms aren't haunted, but I beg to differ because there is no way that what I experienced that day was simply explained. Yes, okay. And last but not least, we have this story from another teacher. On the last day of school, I was getting stuff from the printer room. This was a small room with one door in and one window out. And while I was in there, I heard loud footsteps coming down the hallway. Now, the school had been empty for over 2 weeks. Every single student and teacher had already left for the summer, and it wasn't even close to the time that we were supposed to come back. There was no reason for anyone to be in the building. Obviously, I freaked out and I ran to the window, and I looked out and I saw footprints in the sand that stopped right at the door. Now, the school is in the middle of a field. It's surrounded by nothing but grass and trees. So how could someone have gotten to the school without leaving footprints in the sand? Then I turned and I looked back at the door, and the footprints had appeared on the other side of the door. So whoever had made those prints had vanished. Now, I quickly ran out of the room and I hid under a tree. I was watching that door like a hawk, waiting for whoever was out there to make their next move. Well, after about 10 minutes, I slowly crept back towards the building and I opened the door and I stepped in very slowly and cautiously. I looked around and I didn't see anything. I checked the rooms near the printer room and everything was fine. But then I walked into the hallway and I saw the footprints leading towards the principal's office. I immediately ran out of the building and I went straight to the principal's office. I knew that he lived in the building. He had an apartment on the top floor. So I knocked on his door and he opens it and he looks at me confused and he says, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Have you heard any strange noises lately?" And he says, "No, why would there be strange noises? It's the middle of summer." And I told him about the footprints and everything. And he just kind of laughed it off and he said, "There's no way that what you're saying is actually happening." So he just basically thought that I was crazy. So I shrugged it off and I went to my car. Now, later that night, after I got home, I was watching the news and they were reporting that a local killer had escaped from prison and that he was believed to be armed and dangerous. Now, the police put out a description of this guy and everything he was wearing, including the muddy boots that he was wearing. Now, does any of this sound familiar? Yes. Well, of course it does, because the killer had escaped and he had come to that school to hide because he used to work there. I shit you not. He had worked there years ago and he knew the layout of the building like the back of his hand. He had literally tracked mud all over the halls of that school. Now, the police found him hiding in the exact same principal's office where I had seen the footprints. And I'm telling you this, if I hadn't had decided to investigate those footprints, I probably would have been the one found dead in that principal's office. Yep, that was 3. Scary true last day of school horror stories.